Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister and the member for Eastleigh in paying tribute to Harry Harpham, the honourable member for Sheffield, Brightside and Hillsborough, a former miner who passed away last week. Just a short time ago, Harry used his last question here to ask the Prime Minister questions about the Sheffield Forge Masters and the steel industry. I hope the Prime Minister will reflect on his diligence in representing that industry and his constituency. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I had a chance to have a very nice conversation with Harry's widow, Jill, and his family, and I asked them to say, how would they like to remember Harry? And she gave me this message, which I'll read out. We've admired the bravery and courage he showed in his life, which was formed during the miners' strike and carried him forward for the rest of his life. I'm sure the whole House and many in the much wider community will remember Harry as a decent, honourable man, absolutely dedicated to his community and his constituents, and we're very sad at his passing. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, also following the member for Eastleigh, I have a question on housing. I've got an email from Rosie. She's in her 20s. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Rosie who's written to me doesn't have the same good housing that the Chief Whip of our party does. But aspiration springs eternal. The Rosie who's written to me is in her 20s, and she says, I work incredibly hard at my job, yet I'm still having to live at home with my parents. The lack of housing options, Mr. Speaker, are forcing her to consider moving, even leaving the country. She asked the Prime Minister what action he's going to take to help young people and families suffering from unrealistic house prices and uncapped rents to get somewhere safe and secure to live.
Well, first of all, let me say to the right honourable gentleman, when you get a letter from the Chief Whip, that normally spells trouble. But what I would say to Rosie, the Rosie who wrote to him, is we want to do everything we can to help young people get on the housing ladder. That's why we've got these help to save ISAs, and I hope she's looking at that. We're cutting Rosie's taxes, so this year she'll be able to earn £11,000 before she starts paying any taxes. If Rosie is a tenant in a housing association home, she'll be able to buy that home because we're introducing and extending the right to buy. And of course, with Help to Buy, she will have the opportunity to register for Help to Buy, which gives people the chance to have a smaller deposit on owning their own home. Now, if Rosie is not earning that much money but wants to be a homeowner, shared ownership can make a real difference. And in some parts of the country, you'll only need a deposit of some £1,000 or £2,000 to begin the process of becoming a homeowner. But I recognise in this Parliament, building more houses, following those schemes, we've got to deliver for Rosie.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister wants to help deliver decent housing for Rosie. She lives and works in London, and as the Prime Minister knows, London is very, very expensive. He talks about people getting on the housing ladder, but the reality is that home ownership has fallen under his government by 200,000. It actually rose by 1 million under the last Labour government. His record is one of actually some years of failure on housing. He said that council homes sold under right to buy would be replaced like for like. Can the Prime Minister tell us how that policy is panning out?
But first of all, let me start with what happened under Labour with right-to-buy sales. Because what happened was, one council home was built one council home was built for every 170 council homes they sold. That is the record. Now, we have said that we will make sure that 2 homes are built for every council home in London that is sold. That is because my honourable friend, the member for Richmond Park, insisted on that in an amendment to the housing bill. Now, these take some years to build, but the money that they will be built, or the money comes back to the Treasury.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister ought to be aware that just 1 home has been built for every 8 that have been sold under his government. People are increasingly finding it very difficult to find anywhere to live. The Chancellor's crude cuts in housing benefits for those in supported housing are putting at risk hundreds of thousands of elderly people, people with mental health conditions, war veterans and women fleeing domestic violence who need support. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what estimate housing providers have made in terms of the impact of this policy on supported housing?
First of all, we are going to increase housing supply in the social sector by an £8 billion housing budget during this Parliament that's going to build 400,000 affordable homes. Now, when it comes to our reforms of housing benefit, yes, we have cut housing benefit because it was completely out of control when we came to government. There were families in London who were getting £100,000 of housing benefit per family. Think how many people, think how many Rosies were going to work, working hard every day, just to provide that housing benefit for one family. Now, we support supported housing schemes, and we'll look very carefully to make sure they can work well in the future, but I make no apology for the fact that in this Parliament we are cutting social rents. So if Rosies who are living in social houses going out to work will have lower rents under this government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased the Prime Minister finally got onto the question of supported housing. Housing providers estimate that nearly half of all supported housing schemes will close. 1 in 4 providers are set to close all of their provision. This is a very serious crisis. I assume the Prime Minister is not content to see the elderly, people with mental health conditions and others with nowhere to live. So can he assure the House now that the warm words he's just given on supported housing will be matched by action, and he will stop this cut which will destroy the supported housing sector?
We will continue to support the supported housing sector, and the report that he quotes from was an opinion poll with an extremely leading question, if he actually looks at what it was he was looking at. But the changes that we're making, reducing social rents by 1% every year for 4 years, that is good news for people who go out to work, who work hard, who'd like to pay less rent. And that goes with the lower taxes that they'll be paying and the more childcare they'll be getting. The other change that we're making, which doesn't come into force actually till 2018, is to make sure that we're not paying housing benefit to social tenants way above what we would pay to private sector tenants. Because the simple point is this, and this is where I think Labour have got to focus: every penny you spend on housing subsidy is money you can't spend on building houses. So let's take this back. Let's take this right back to Rosie in the beginning. She wants a country where we build homes. She wants a country where you can buy a home. She wants a country with a strong economy so you can afford to buy a home. All of those things we're delivering, and you won't deliver them if you go on spending more and more money on subsidised housing and housing benefit. One day Labour's got to realise that welfare bills have to be brought under control.
Mr. Speaker, Shelter estimates that the measures in the housing bill will lose 180,000 affordable homes over the next 4 years. The Prime Minister is actually overseeing a very damaging housing crisis. It's pricing out people from buying. It's not providing enough social housing. Therefore, many people are forced to rely on the private rented sector. The benches behind him recently voted against an amendment put forward by my honourable friend for homes to be fit for human habitation. Labour invested £22 billion in government in bringing social homes up to decent home standard. There are now 11 million people in this country who are private renters. Does the Prime Minister know how many of those homes don't meet the decent home standard?
To listen to Labour when in the last 5 years we built more council houses than they built in 13 years. Where was he? Where was he when that was going on? 13 years and an absolutely hopeless record on housing. What we're doing is an £8 billion housing budget that will provide 400,000 new affordable homes, a target to build 1 million homes during this Parliament, getting housing benefit down so we can spend money on housing, and having a strong economy that can support the housing we need.
Mr. Speaker, I was asking through you, the Prime Minister, how many of the 11 million renters are living in homes that do not meet the decent home standard and therefore substandard. I'll help him. 1/3 of those in the private rented sector don't meet decent home standards. Shelter found that 6 out of 10 renters have issues such as damp, mould, leaking roofs and windows. It's simply not good enough. Millions are struggling to get the home they deserve. More families slipping into temporary accommodation, elderly threatened with eviction, homelessness rising, too few homes being built, social housing under pressure, families forced into low-standard, overpriced private rented sector, young people unable to move out of the family home and start their own lives. When is the Prime Minister going to realise there is a housing crisis in Britain? His government needs to address it now so that we do not continue with this dreadful situation in this country.
Well, let me just take one of the figures that he mentions about homelessness. Homelessness is less than half the peak today that it was under the last Labour government. There's a simple point here. You can only invest in new houses. You can only restore existing houses. You can only build new houses. You can only support people into those houses if you've got a strong economy. Now, we inherited mass unemployment, an economy that had completely collapsed, a banking crisis, and now we've got zero inflation, wages growing, unemployment at 5%, an economy growing, and people able, for the first time, to look to their future and see they can buy and own a house in our country.
As Laura accurately predicted, Mr Corbyn went on housing, raised a number of issues through his 6 questions, which were all on housing, and the Prime Minister's main response was to reel off a list of things that the government had done or was about to do on housing. We'll discuss a number of things in a moment, but first let's find out, Joko, what did our viewers make of it?
Well, it was all on housing and they responded in that way, but people felt Jeremy Corbyn needed to be tougher with the Prime Minister. John said, is Jeremy Corbyn the leader of the opposition or just the opposition housing minister? He needs to ask questions on other subjects. This from Herbie. Why does Jeremy Corbyn continue to let Cameron off the hook? Surely he should be addressing the doctors' strike. He should be loudly challenging Cameron on every point, not adopting lacklustre ramblings. But Robert Fox says, well done, Jezza, clear winner, a bit of venom for a change, Cameron rant as usual. Edward Buxton, though, a poor performance from Jeremy Corbyn, a gentle, methodical approach simply doesn't work at PMQs. For most voters, it's the only time they ever see Parliament in play, and they see David Cameron easily swatting away Jeremy Corbyn's questions. Martin McHugh, I haven't done the sums here, but Mr Cameron claims he can build 400,000 homes for £8 billion. That's only 20,000 each. Bargain. Helen Manning says, poor Rosie chose the wrong champion in Jeremy Corbyn. His argument got wiped out by the Prime Minister. Too much money paid in benefits equals no house for Rosie ever. And Mark Egan says Cameron needs to come down from his ivory tower and have a walk around the West End of London at night. I've never seen so many people sleeping rough on the streets.
That's all, folks.